My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the publisher of the Texas National Security Review and the editor-in-chief of War on the Rocks. Earlier this month, the Clements Center down at UT welcomed Danielle Pletka. She's the Senior Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. At this event, she spoke about a broad array of issues related to the Middle East and Israel. Before joining AEI, Pletka was a longtime senior professional staff member for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I think you'll enjoy this episode.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about Middle East and realignment with Israel. So this is a thing and not a thing. You know, it's a much hyped new concept, a new idea that some have become enamored of, which is that the Middle East has changed, it's transformed, and is now a place in which Israel is welcome by the Arab world, and that there are others on the outs. This is sort of partly true, partly not true, partly a narrative, partly a conceit by some, I would say especially in Israel. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the Israelis perceive it and how I see that. I'm going to try not to talk for too long because I actually really prefer Q&A, and I'm betting that you do too. So I'll talk for a little while, and then we'll turn to Q&A, and then if we're all bored, we can go and get coffee. So the way I divide up this question of alignment in the region, and these are always, I'm just about to apologize to the podcast because I just hit the mic. But the way that I divide it up is from the creation of the State of Israel up until the Islamic Revolution in Iran. So, 48, 49 until 79, you basically see a static array of countries. You see Iran and Israel in a having diplomatic relations in an alliance. You see them more and less, and we can talk about this in Q&A, it's not worth diving too far into now, allied with the United States. And then you see everybody else. We used to refer to, and by the way, never refer to anymore, the Arab League. It was not much of a thing when it was a thing, and now it's really not much of a thing at all. But we talked about the rest of the Arab world in terms of the Arab League, and we knew who the head of the Arab League was. I could not tell you who the head of the Arab League is today, actually. And that was it. Okay, so you had the Sunni states basically aligned against, Sunni-led states, I should say, aligned against Israel with each other, part of sort of the old Arab world that we used to talk about. And then we had Iran and Israel. Then the Islamic Revolution happened, and everything, of course, changed. A lot more changed than just Iran. Iran's relationship with the United States changed. Iran's relationship with its neighbors changed. Iran's place in the Middle East changed. And I would say that Iran has continued to play an extraordinarily important leadership role in defining models of foreign policy, security policy, and to a lesser extent, economic policy in the region. Again, something we can talk about in Q&A a little bit if you want to, but I can really easily go down the Iran rabbit hole because it's so fascinating, and I'm not going to. So we have that period, and then we have the post-79 period. And there you saw Israel, the United States, and then eventually Egypt and Jordan become part of sort of the small group that were all at peace. And then there was everybody else. And there were internal tensions between what we would call, the Arab world country and the Persians and Iran. But at the end of the day, that's kind of how it was stacked up. And it kept that way. And you saw a certain unity in foreign policy. You saw a certain unity in relations with the United States, some more, some less, some better, some worse. But again, you saw a static period. That changed. And I'll be honest with you and tell you I'm not quite sure where to pinpoint the change. Was it the Arab Spring? Was it 2011? Or was it the signing of the JCPOA, what is more commonly known as the Iran deal? But at some time in that period, between 2011 and 2015, things really got shaken up. And of course, that is common knowledge to anybody who reads the newspapers. And they changed. Perceptions started to change. Habits of conversation within the region started to change, and alliances started to change. And this is the moment when Israel began to see its relationship with a lot of the Sunni Arab world change. Now, let's talk a little bit about that. Why? Well, first of all, the cause of the Palestinians has been something that, while again has been at the front of the headlines, at the first sort of point of reference in talking points for the Arab world, the excuse, not just du jour or du semaine, but really the excuse of like a half a century. Why are things so bad in my country? Well, when the Palestinians are free, you too can have a decent government. You too can have an accountable government. I say this in a sort of a humorous way, but this is 100% true. This was the line of Hafez al-Assad in Syria. It was the line of his son Bashar al-Assad. It was the line of everybody. No, we don't have democracy because they don't. And we're 100% focused on them, and then we can come back to us. But if your life stinks, just know it's because their life stinks. And whose fault is that? Israel's. And, that sounds like a caricature, but that was basically boiled down the talking point of the Arab world. So all of a sudden, you have a bunch of new figures. All of the establishment that we learned, people always ask me, why did you decide to become a Middle East scholar? I can't even call myself that with a straight face, but why did you become a Middle East person? What's your affinity? And I always tell them, well, I'm not good at learning new names, and I'm not really good at paying attention to kind of small changes, and luckily nothing ever changes in the Middle East, and every single leader remains the same forever. So I'm good. Also, it turned out that if you're always pessimistic, you can pretty much always be right about the Middle East. That's another thing we can talk about in the Q&A. But this started to change, right? All of these people who had been, to my mind and to the mind of a lot of my colleagues, looking for trouble for a long time, finally met it in 2011. And, we can go up to North Africa. Everything started, obviously, in Tunisia. Zine Abidine Ben Ali, a creepy dictator who looks like Dracula, was one of the first to go. But many fell after him. Others did not, and that's actually a very interesting area of study. Who didn't get affected by the Arab Spring and who did? And so all of a sudden, you saw that leaders who for decades had basically paid no attention to their own people were suddenly really forced into it. Right? Wow, damn, you hate me. And the answer is, yeah, we do. And by the way, you, whoever you are, fill in the blank, Hosni Mubarak, Bashar al-Assad, you could keep going. Yeah, we do. We hate you. Because you're awful to us. You have delivered nothing but backwards progress for the last 50 years to your people. No surprise. Guess what? Given the opportunity, given the spark, we actually were happy to keep fanning it, and we're out in the street, and now you're gone. And I think what happened there was that a lot of people, a lot of countries that we had considered spokesmen for the Middle East, whether self-appointed or not. Is it okay with Syria? If it's okay with Syria, then the Gulf can do it. They were sort of the keepers of the flame on what the message of the region would be to the outside world, particularly on issues like Israel and the Palestinians. Ditto, Hosni Mubarak, Egypt, had already been fading for a while, did not have the role that it had for many years for a whole host of reasons. But Egypt now really playing absolutely no role on the sort of the regional stage any longer, completely and totally preoccupied with internal matters. Then you have what's going on in Lebanon. You have the transformation of Lebanon from a state in conflict to a state largely dominated by Iran and by Hezbollah. I said this morning to a group of students, I never mentioned Jordan, and there's actually a reason for that, because there's no reason to mention Jordan. But yeah, Jordan, we can talk about it if you want to. All of a sudden, the Gulf starts to look more stable. We've got the Iraq War and the Iranians, and people who had been in the forefront are no longer in the forefront. And the region becomes much more concerned about the problems on their doorstep, right? Oh my God, I might be the next to go. Maybe actually my number one priority isn't the Palestinians. Okay. Now, the Palestinians have, by the way, helped all along the way by making pretty much every bad choice they could have made. Hey, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. Who should we stick with? Yeah, Saddam Hussein. Probably a bad choice. I'd say almost definitely a bad choice. And this is reflected in every single choice that ends up being made. There's the whole Hamas, PA, Fatah election debacle that happens under the Bush administration, which further worries everybody about where the Palestinians are headed. And so slowly but surely they fade off of the top 10 talking points. And this is also something important for Israel, right? Because when we're not talking about that, then Israel suddenly becomes a country that shares some of the challenges that the Gulf and others are looking at. When you have the governments of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates saying, no, you don't understand, the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and Hezbollah and all of these are terrorist groups, and we're going to designate them as terrorist groups, I mean, more, by the way, than the United States has done. For Israel, that's like, right. And what, of course, is the other public enemy number one? Iran. What exacerbates this? So we have the dynamics of the Arab Spring and the changes that are going on, and some generational changes. And I know you guys are going to want to talk a little bit about what's going on with Saudi Arabia and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Jamal Khashoggi, and I'm happy to talk about that too. But on the United States side, you have an administration under Barack Obama that takes a very different view of the Middle East. The United States has always had a foreign policy that is basically defined by our relationship with the Sunnis, at least since 1979, right? Everything went to hell after the hostage crisis. The Iranians are bad guys. They're trying to murder their own people, our people in the street. They're sponsoring terrorist groups. There's nothing to like there. Clearly, we see it the same way as the Sunni Arab world, and so all of our relationships are through that prism. The Obama administration didn't see it that way. And the president, one of the things that I said to folks in D.C. who were very angry about this switch was President Obama, when he was campaigning, said this. You cannot say that he did not tell everybody exactly what it is he was interested in doing, because he did. And then he did it. And you don't like it, and I get it, but it's not like anyone pulled a fast one on us. The JCPOA, and the entire run-up to this, the secret dialogue with the Iranians, this, it felt like something conjured up at a think tank. And I'm at a think tank, so I know what gets conjured up at think tanks. But it felt like one of those things where a bunch of people who didn't have positions of responsibility in government or elsewhere, talking about this new way to play the game, right? Right. I mean, look. We've been working with the Sunnis. Look at them. Saudi Arabia, Egypt. These are terrible places. Why not talk to the Iranians? Why not reorient our policy? Think of all the good things that can happen. And of course, this is, in my mind, a house of cards, because it is predicated on a whole set of ideas about Iran that actually President Obama laid out when he rolled out the JCPOA, that there is, in fact, internal conflict in Iran about the nature of the regime among people who are inside the government, that there are moderates and pragmatists, and people who want keys and cakes. Almost all of you will not remember that reference, but you got it. And you can just sort of hear them saying it. And yes, I mean, if we're able to straighten out this, if we're able to sweep decades of enmity away, then we could suddenly begin to look at Syria, and maybe we could change the orientation of Syria. And if Syria no longer feels threatened, maybe they'll stop supporting Hezbollah. And if Hezbollah stops getting support from Iran and from Syria, then they're not going to have anything to do in Lebanon, which means they're not going to threaten the Israelis. And that's going to be great. Why did nobody think of this great idea before? Well, they did, but it didn't work out. And I would say that this one hasn't worked out that well either. And we can also talk about the JCPOA. For all of you who want to talk about the JCPOA, I'm delighted. Whatever happened, whether we see merit in the JCPOA or not, whether we think this was the greatest deal or what most of my very honest Democratic friends say, which is this isn't a great deal. This wasn't really well negotiated, but it's better than no deal. Okay, which I think is the argument that holds the most water for those who are supporters of the JCPOA. But for whatever reason, in rolling this out, President Obama seemed to bite off something bigger. The idea that we should suddenly stop looking at the Middle East through the prism of whatever, Jerusalem, Riyadh, Cairo, and start looking at it through the prism of Tehran. Okay. Now, I don't think that he did that in the sort of blunt way that I just described it. But let me tell you, everybody in the Middle East thinks that, just in that cartoonish way. I'll give you some anecdotal information to back it up in just a second. He gave that interview to Jeff Goldberg in The Atlantic, the one where, you know, he said it was a great moment of relief when he didn't have to go over the red line and take care of serious chemical weapons attacks on their own people. That interview. And he also said to the Saudis, you are just going to have to learn to share the Middle East with the Iranians. Now, for pretty much everybody, this was really not a good thing to say. Because first of all, it's not in American interest to see the Middle East shared between the Saudis and the Iranians. I could pick pretty much anyone else who I'd rather see share the Middle East, frankly. But also the notion that the Middle East is a fiefdom to be divided up between either the Saudis or the Iranians is kind of an offensive concept. All this did is cement in the eyes of every single country in the region that wasn't Iran that the president was basically working for the Iranians. This was basically what he wanted. He's been with the Iranians all along, yada, yada, yada. Now, I take a much more nuanced view of it, but I think he put himself in this spot. And when you go to the region, when I was in the region in the immediate aftermath of the election of Donald Trump, once he became president and saw a bunch of regional leaders, what I heard from all of them was the same thing. Anything will be better than Barack Obama. Anything. We don't trust the United States anymore. You don't have our back. You're not with us. You're with the Iranians. Anything is better than that. And unfortunately, what you see is we've actually just seen the pendulum swing. If the President Obama was entirely too solicitous of the interests of the Iranians in the region and at home, President Trump has now become entirely too solicitous of the opponents of Iran. This is what I call the politicization of pretty much everything. The great example that I heard the other day is apparently somebody was telling me that In-N-Out Burger, is there In-N-Out Burger here? I just don't get why that's a big thing, but we can talk about that afterwards too. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but I went there and I was like, why is this so great? But anyway, apparently In-N-Out Burger, I don't know, did something that showed some micro-deviationism from liberal orthodoxy, and there was a big boycott. In-N-Out Burger movement. It's like, really? You know, hamburgers are now political as well? Isn't that kind of crazy? But Middle East politics have also become part of this, and this is a truly lamentable trend in America, in Washington, everywhere. And so the idea in Washington is, well, you know, Iran is the country of the Democrats, and Israel is the country of the Republicans. Iran is the country of the Democrats, and Saudi Arabia is the country of the Republicans. This is the height of stupid, and a really bad way to think about the region, and a really bad way to fashion foreign policy. But we were headed there. We've been headed there for the last 10 years, and I would say that we're there. And I don't see that fixing itself. Now, what's in this for the Arabs? Okay, so the Arabs, and forgive me because I don't think of the Arabs as some great monolith, but for the purposes of this talk and of alignment one way or another, I'm using the expression, believe me, I see plenty more nuance there. But we're still going to talk about the Arabs. And by this, I mean mostly the Sunni countries of the Gulf and the Levant to a certain extent. What's in it for them? First of all, they have an entirely mythologized view of what Israel is. Okay? So don't forget, one of the turning points of the relationship between Israel and the United States is the Six-Day War. Right? This is when the world wakes up and is like, wow, all of these Arab countries jump on the Israelis and they kick their asses in 6 days. These are really amazing people. Okay? There begins. You know, if it didn't begin with the War of Independence in 48, 49, then there it begins. This Israel is invincible, fabulous little country. And even though there have been decades of propaganda against Israel in the Arab world, there's also been this kind of, wow, right? You know, the Jews, the Zionists, They're really something. And they believe this. One of my Israeli friends, who's a senior government official, confided in me last year. I said, so you guys are talking to the Emiratis. That's great. He said, yeah, we've been talking to them for a long time, but they kind of have unreasonable expectations of what we can do. And I thought, right, that makes total sense. Because when Israel was yes, derided, but also kind of on this pedestal. So in the Arab world, the answer is, yeah, we're going to work with the Israelis against the Iranians. Look, Stuxnet, look at all these cool things they can do. They've got good intelligence, and so for the Arabs, I think a lot of Arab governments see things that way, and I think they like working with the Israelis, which is great. And out of practical interests and shared goals come relationships, come a familiarity that stops demonization. Those are all very good things. But, of course, there are other factors as well. But let's circle back to that in just a moment. What's in it for the Israelis? Well, duh. Everything is in it for the Israelis. They have wanted to be accepted in the Middle East for a very long time. They like this. And they believe that, when the threats in the region to them are diminished, that is better for their people, their economy, their independence, better for the long-term survival and security and peace of the State of Israel, and that's a good thing. I agree with the Israelis about that. I think the Israelis probably see this as a more permanent transformation than I do. And this is how I want to circle back to the Arabs again. I don't think this is a deep thing. I think this is a mile wide and a centimeter deep, in my mixing of metric and non-metric systems. I just realized that. I don't think this is a big, deep phenomenon. I think this is an elite phenomenon in the Arab world. It is a government phenomenon in the Arab world. It's not the people who think this. And the reason I say that is a very pedantic one, basically. Until you change your education system, if you have spent the last 7 decades telling everybody that the Zionist and the Jew is the dirtball, the enemy, the conniver, the enemy of all that is good, the oppressor of the Palestinians, yada, 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 to turn around and say, but they're great, love them, is not really a persuasive system. And you cannot just turn a population around like that. This is something, you see this actually a lot, and this is a little bit of a digression, but it's an interesting one. You see this a lot among generations of scholars. We are trapped in our generation. So if I think of myself as somebody who went to college and grad school right around the time of the revolution in Iran, and that cohort of my generation who does Middle East and of the Iranians who left and are now in the United States, all of us have a tendency to be frozen in time in thinking about Iran. Someone who was born then is an adult now and has children. Most people who live in Iran don't even remember the revolution. Any narrative about the Shah is one that they learned that was written by the Islamic Republic. Now, we don't think about that enough. And as a result, we make assumptions about what's going to happen, like I made about what would happen in Iraq after Saddam Hussein, which is that people really understand where to go next and what to do. And this is very important when we talk about the transformation and the realignment of the Middle East and Israel, right? Because actually, if you teach your people something, invariably there is no inner truth about the fact that Jews are actually not monkeys and pigs, and that Zionists aren't actually evil, rapacious oppressors. If you have learned that, that is what you think. And there's been so much reinforcement of that, that a couple of years of secret dialogue and visits from rabbis' groups, which are constantly going over to the Gulf, is not going to change that. So I don't see this as much of a transformation as I think some of my Israeli friends do and some others do. Where do we go from here? I don't think any of us really know. And part of the reason for that is because the region is in such a state of flux right now that, well, I can always stick with my pessimistic predictions and say that probably nothing good is in the future, and you'll all go, Danielle Pletka is quite prescient. The reality is we don't know. There are generational changes that are going on. There are changes in American attitudes towards engagement with the region. There are changes in markets, in energy markets. There are changes in population. And all of those will factor into how the region changes. When we look at North Africa, for example, just to kind of go back to where the Arab Spring began, what we see is quite a lot of stability in the monarchies, right? We see the monarchy in Morocco pretty stable, no real spring there, some transformational changes, economic, parliamentary, and I'd say Morocco, pretty stable, younger king, moving slowly into the future. Libya, yeah, nothing good is happening. Algeria, not much good is happening. In Tunisia, we see some post-Arab Spring success, but we also see some worrying trends. I could say that about pretty much anywhere, couldn't I? But hard to know where the future goes. Probably Tunisia is still the place where people who believe that Islamists can have a positive role in a democratically structured country, it is probably the best example of that. It's the one to hold up. It's the one where, an Islamist party, Al-Nahda, really actually played a much more constructive role in the post-Arab Spring reconstruction of the country than they did elsewhere. Of course, that has therefore caused other Islamist parties who are less constructive to rise up, who are more purist in their approach and therefore less congenial towards democracy, democratic change, and realignments in the region. If we look at the Gulf, what we see is there have been some generational changes, but we've also seen some real problems. The war in Yemen. The war in Yemen is not going to go anywhere good. I would say that, as some of you have heard me say about American foreign policy, the biggest problem is Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates don't actually know what they want to achieve in Yemen. They know that they don't want the Houthis in power. I agree with them. We don't want the Houthis in power, just because who knows what percentage of the Yemeni population the Houthis make up. Anyone? What is it? 4 to 5. You weren't even close. You were closer than everybody else who wasn't brave enough to raise their hand, though. It's a tiny part of the population, oppressed, deserves more right, probably shouldn't be running the country in a junta from Sana'a. They know vaguely what they want, but they don't know how the problems of Yemen are going to be solved. The problems of Yemen are not about the Houthis. They're about the North-South divide, about tribes, about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, about legacy issues relating to political parties and nepotism. The Saudis and the Emiratis are not going to be doing any nation building in Yemen. And so this is going to be a problem that continues to fester and that will draw the United States back again and again. We've now seen the Saudis attempt to create in the Gulf a weird new alignment, which is them, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Egyptians against Qatar and Oman. I'm not quite sure why anybody there in Riyadh thinks that it serves him, but Mohammed bin Salman has, as we can tell from recent headlines, not been the greatest decision maker in seeing what the implications are of the decisions he makes as leader of Saudi Arabia, as de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. So, this is why we see, the Qataris are on the outs. The Qataris, as a result, have invited in the Turks and the Russians to support them, and the Iranians, of course, who were already there. I don't see how that's a good outcome for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, but, these are changes that are happening every day that we see that have the potential to be transformational, but not all in good ways. Most of them don't actually involve Israel in any way, except to kind of cement the notion that some of us are with Israel and some of us are against Israel. We're not seeing transformation at all in Iran, of course. And because this, whenever you talk about Israel and the region, you're invariably talking about Israel and the Sunni countries. And so, there's a lot to talk about in terms of Iranian politics. There's a lot potentially ahead in Iran, particularly when Ayatollah Khamenei dies, and there's a contest to see whether there'll be a new supreme leader or whether there won't, and who it will be. So all of these things have the potential to shake up the region, but I would say that the broader realignments are not the biggest transformative force. Again, one of the things that people forget is just how many young people live in this part of the world. Unemployment rates, even in successful Arab economies, are around 25 to 30% for young men. That is a huge force for instability in any country. I don't care what your religion is. I don't care what you think of women. It is a huge force for instability. And while I think Mohammed bin Salman, in authoring their future 2030 plan, understands that there needs to be an economic transformation, I don't think there's anybody in the region, Egypt, Saudi, or anywhere else, that knows what it takes and is actually willing and able to execute what it takes to find a future that is economically stable. And that is, at the end of the day, going to be just a huge, huge factor. I want to end with something that is on a lot of people's minds, because it's in the headlines. And I've talked about it with every single person I've talked to here, and in DC, and with a lot of my friends in the region. And that's what happened to Jamal Khashoggi. This shines a light on all of the questions that we've just been talking about, because this is about Turkey, okay? Now, why have we gotten so much information? I mean, I looked this morning on my phone. I'm not going to hold it up, but I have on my phone a picture of the two planes the 15 Saudis arrived in. Okay, them arriving, them going through the airport, them walking into their hotel, them in the lobby of their hotel, them outside arriving at the embassy, the van leaving the embassy, the fiancé outside the embassy, the questions about watches, WhatsApp, phones, everything. Why are the Turks so suddenly forthcoming? Because, well, yes, it's a surveillance state, it's a police state in a lot of ways, but also because the Turks are now perceived to be the godfathers of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East, and the Saudis, and they don't get along. So how is that a factor in Khashoggi's disappearance? Then, before, we talked about MBS, not a great decision maker. The kidnapping of Rafiq Hariri, the Prime Minister of Lebanon. What the hell was that, and what was he thinking? Honestly, to this day, I can't tell you, because it has only helped the Iranians. It didn't do anything good with Hariri. It didn't do anything good in Lebanon. It had an absolutely unmitigated bad outcome. This is is sort of part two of the evidence that Mohammed bin Salman is not making good decisions, the consequences of which he is not thinking through. Okay, so could Jamal Khashoggi actually have been either murdered or kidnapped from the embassy? Yes. There have been 15 other journalists who have been disappeared, abducted, subsequently reappeared, not reappeared. This is not a good thing. Where's a lot of the information coming from also on this case? Al Jazeera. Guess who runs Al Jazeera? Yes, it's the Qataris. Qataris also have an agenda against the Saudis. So we have here a complete freaking mess. So anybody who thought, oh, this is all sorting itself out really well, the next generation's really going to be great and visionary, none of the problems are going to happen, the answer is no, no, no. These remain huge problems. I have a tiny, tiny bit of hope that Khashoggi was just abducted, but I don't know, because nobody knows what happened. And this will be a very big dilemma for the President of the United States. If, in fact, as I suggested earlier, we are now in the mode of looking through Riyadh at the region, and Riyadh is in the business of kidnapping people who are residents of the United States and journalists or writers for the Washington Post and murdering them in their diplomatic facilities in a NATO country, yeah, that's probably not going to be the right prism through which we should look at the Middle East. And the question of what to do is going to be a very challenging one to the president. And he's already admitted that he's not sure where to go with that or what to do. So we're all going to be watching the headlines. I'm going to leave it at that, because I got very far away from Israel, which is probably a good thing, because that's not the most interesting part of the region anymore. But I'm really delighted to take questions, talk about pretty much whatever you want to talk about. Politics, the region, MBS, Khashoggi, whatever it is. And I'll do my best to answer you seriously and thoroughly. And that's it. There you go.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.